This week, we're very excited to have Juan Mateos-Garcia from Nesta. Juan is Director of Data Analytics at Nesta, which, as many of you know, is the UK's Innovation Foundation. He's going to be presenting some new work, which I think is joint with Alex Bishop at Nesta, which uses business website data to monitor economic exposure and resilience to Covid-19. So it's very timely work. It's also very kind of innovative in its use of data sets and research methods, and I think has a lot for the people at CASA to to learn from and to be inspired by.
Thanks so much for inviting, Max, and thanks everyone. It's very exciting to be presenting this work here. I'm just going to share my screen, and I've started my timer. Okay, so you can see nothing basically. It's like a dead screen. This is the presentation. Actually, one thing to say before I get started, let me just change this, is that I've already uploaded the presentation.
I can see all your...
Yeah, I have already. One sec. I'm just going to share with you, put a link here. Oh, it's not working. Oh, sorry. I'll share the presentation later. For some reason, my link cutting is not working right now. But yeah, the presentation is ready to be shared with everyone. But yeah, let me just start. Right. Basically, what I'm going to be doing here is talking about some work we have been doing measuring the economic exposure and resilience to COVID-19. And we do this using business website and search data. And this is taking place as part of a project in collaboration with the Scottish Government, where we are exploring how this kind of data could be used to understand how different local economies are exposed or / able to diversify from COVID, and what this means for policy. I mean, just to give you a summary of what I'm going to be saying. Basically, we develop prototype indicators about economic exposure and resilience to COVID-19. And basically, to do this, we're going to be using business website data. We're going to be analyzing this using machine learning and network analysis. And basically, the idea is that we're going to be taking text from business websites, generating vocabularies of terms at the sector level. We're going to be querying Google search trends to look at the evolution of search interest for those terms over time. And we're going to be paying special attention to what happens to search interest after March 2020, which is, I guess, when COVID is declared a global pandemic, also normalizing by search trends the previous year. And I'll be saying something about how that works a bit later. Then, in addition to looking at search trends by sector, we're also going to be using the business descriptions in this from these websites to train a machine learning model that we use to build a sector space. The idea here is that the machine learning model is going to give us, for each company, a vector of probabilities that the company belongs to a sector. And obviously, the idea is that the highest probability is going to be to the sector it actually belongs to. But actually, we can use the whole vector to look at similarities between sectors. And the idea is that we're going to be almost like assume that say sectors that are similar to each other within this sectoral map, or companies that are in one sector are better able to move into sectors which are similar or close. And this represents an opportunity for diversification, and they might be able to explore this opportunity in response to the COVID shock. And then basically we're going to take all of this information, which is basically rankings of sectoral exposure to COVID by local authority district and month, and also shares of employment in sectors with different levels, different options to diversify away from COVID by local authority district from month, and we're going to map this. And also we're going to be looking at the link between these variables and outcomes, which is going to be changes in claimant counts, which is, I guess, it feels like the only variable that we currently have at the right level of geographical resolution to look at the impact of COVID in local economies. This is very much work in progress, as you will see. Obviously, a very complex pipeline, lots of things to fine-tune and polish, and and really looking forward to your comments about how to improve it. So I guess I'll probably take a lot of my time, so I guess the idea here is that we are interested in measuring the economic impact of COVID-19. Obviously, it has had an impact on supply through the lockdown, as well as on demand by creating social distancing. Obviously, people are not able to demand the same goods because they are staying home. They are demanding different goods, and also there's uncertainty that might have an impact on investment. Obviously, companies are not static as this shock happens. They respond by adapting. They might change what they do in terms of the levels of activity. They might change what they do in terms of moving into other activities. They might innovate as well. This has an impact, and obviously, this is we have a feedback loops going on here. It's a complex system. Basically, what we really want to know, I guess, as researchers who want to inform policy, is what firms, sectors, and places are most exposed to these shocks in order to inform policies to mitigate. And we would want to know how are businesses reacting to this shock, and how can businesses react to this shock in order to inform policies to adapt. And we want the right indicators to about this process to inform these decisions and these policies. And this is just an example from Brighton, where I live, where you have had obviously these wonderful coffees that had lots of people sitting outside before COVID. There's been obviously the shock of COVID has led these coffee shops to close. They have innovated in terms of delivering coffee, having click and collect, and the idea is how can we could we generate indicators that help us give us the sense of how, to which extent do the sectors that compose a local economy are able to behave in this way. So obviously everyone's looking at this kind of question or similar questions. There's a lot of work going on that's using different kind of data sources to look at the economic impact of COVID, including people looking at labor market data. And I guess this is the idea that you look at what occupations are exposed to COVID based on their ability to work from home and things like that. People are using business panels as well. So obviously you survey businesses like almost in real time and ask them about what are the impacts of COVID on what they have been doing and what they're expecting to see happening in the future. And then you have the, I guess, so-called big data approaches. And there's many things that people have done, very exciting work. Like looking at the impact of COVID-19 exposure of different businesses to COVID-19 by looking at mentions in earning calls, look at changes in demand using transaction data like credit cards, look at sectoral exposure through changes in labor demand proxied via job ads, and then like what we're going to be doing here is using business websites. There's been like a really interesting work by researchers at CEW in Germany looking at COVID notices that businesses post in their websites to look at the exposure to COVID. And obviously the thing to say here as a pluralist, I embrace the fact that all of these things have their pros and their cons. Anyone working with official data obviously loves their representativity and comparability, but there are lags. Sometimes the information you get out is a bit of a black box. And I think very importantly, this kind of data assumes that all businesses respond in the same way to the shock. It doesn't consider really firm heterogeneity or even heterogeneity between different places. The business panels generally very small sample frames, response biases. We know that distressed businesses don't have so much time to spend responding to surveys. And with the big data, I guess, obviously it's very timely, it's very granular. You can create very fun plots with it. But also there are lots of questions about the representativity, comparability, and reproducibility of what you do with this data. And I guess what actually we try to do in this paper, even though it says measuring exposure and resilience to COVID-19 with business and search and website data, it really should have said measuring the exposure and resilience to COVID-19 with business, website, search, and official data, because actually we're going to be using official data as well to generate some of our indicators, as I will show. Our research questions are what firms, sectors, and places are most exposed to the COVID-19 shock? What are their diversification options? As I said, we combine the various data sets like web sources with open and official data. I guess the source of data for our business websites is Glass, is a big data startup. we have 8.8 million websites in the UK. They collected in June 2020. They say it's around 90% coverage of UK websites. They obtain this from web domain registries. They enrich it using machine learning. And basically, the main thing is that this contains business descriptions, which is the main thing we're going to be using with the data. It contains postcodes, it contains stuff like that, but actually we're not going to be using that a lot. The main thing we're interested in using here is the descriptions of what the businesses do, because we want to use those with descriptions to generate vocabularies of terms that relate to what industries do. And actually, by doing that, we're going to be able to take this vocabulary from the business website data to the SIG codes, and then we're going to be using that to estimate shares of employment in sectors which are exposed to COVID or able to diversify from COVID in different local authorities. Having said this, we have validated the class data, and at the end of the presentation, there's like an annex with like lots of the validation work we have been doing, which includes validating with the company's house, but also we have validated some of our results over time, comparing trends in terms of like search for terms related to what different industries do, and other data that has been published recently around like the incidence of COVID in different places, as well as, for example, footfall data that Google has released to look at how people are respecting or not social distancing rules. And I guess in general, the thing to say is that all of this validation suggests that class, even though it's got some biases and some coverage issues for some sectors, looks like a reasonably good and potentially useful data source to use to look at the question we are going to be focusing on here. And obviously, we can discuss that in further detail afterwards. And if you want to deep dive, there are lots of slides at the end of the presentation looking at all these questions of validation and coverage. Okay, this is the pipeline. So actually, class data, the business websites are just the beginning. Basically, we fuzzy match. I'm just going to be taking you through this thing with my cursor. So basically, because we want to develop vocabularies of terms at the sectoral level, we match class data with company's house on company names using fuzzy matching, the method we have developed. And that gives us the SIG codes for the business descriptions. Then basically, we look for different terms which are salient for different sectors, and I'll show you in a bit what that looks like. So we get collections of terms that are relevant for these different SIG divisions, and we query the Google Search Trends API with those terms. And basically, this basically allows us to generate almost like search trends for terms that relate to different industries. And because we have the industry data, then we are able to match this with NOMIS, with official data, like we look at business registry employment survey data, to basically say, okay, if a level of like search for this sector has declined, or this sector is at the of all of our sectors, they are at the bottom in terms of like changes in search interest as a consequence of COVID. Then what share of people in this location work in this sector, and we use this to generate our measures of exposure. And then, as I said, we also use the business descriptions to train a machine learning model that allows us to build this sector space where similar sectors where sectors that are similar are close to each other. And basically, then we analyze connections in the network in order to get a sense of the extent to which, say, sectors which we identify as being highly exposed to COVID based on the search data might be able to diversify into other sectors or activities which are less exposed to COVID. And we are going to, again, rank sectors based on their diversification opportunities and use this to estimate employment share in different sectors, in different local authorities. And then also there's other stuff in this data that we're not using here, but we are using in follow-up work, including we are extracting social media data. We are analyzing these COVID-19 notices, which I mentioned. And then just in addition to be able to look at this local sectoral picture, which I think is already interesting, as I hope you'll agree. We also look at the firm level impacts and adaptation, but that's for a future presentation and probably another paper. This thing, as you'll see, is already looking quite busy. Okay, just to maybe be a bit more, I guess, give you a more tangible example of what this looks like. We take this is a business website description. about this company, what they do. Basically, imagine we take all of the business descriptions for companies in this sector, which I think is creative arts. We aggregate all of them for all of the companies in the sector. We look for those which are salient about a sector, and basically it gives us a collection of terms, and then we run them against Google search, and basically look at the evolution of interest in those terms. And actually you see this is the evolution of search for these terms, and you see some of them really plummeting after March because theaters closed and people weren't searching for theaters online because they couldn't go to see theaters play. Obviously, this builds on an established body of literature using Google search data to proxy consumer user interest in various subjects. Obviously, this has backfired horribly in some research studies, like using Google for flu trends. There's like a link to the literature in the annex. Our pipeline here is that we, as I said, aggregate company descriptions over sectors and extract salient terms. We basically then, stem and remove duplicates. Then we basically query those terms against Google search. And this is super involved because actually what we do is use this thing called the Google Trends Anchor Bank. It's a Python tool that you can use to extract normalized Google search trends over time and over space, which is really useful, but also takes a lot of work to implement because you very quickly get into hitting Google's API limits. So we had to do a bit of engineering to be able to collect this data. So it's quite involved. And then I guess some observations is that the results will be dominated by the most popular subsectors in glass. Some of the C codes, as anyone who works with official data knows, are not very informative. Obviously, other manufacturing activities not elsewhere classified. What's going to be the salient terms that define the sectors in there? It's going to be a jumble because that SIG is a jumble. And also, obviously, there's the issue of interpreting terms. So, for example, in this example here, we have dance, still going strong after the lockdown. This is not because dance companies have somehow managed to stay open. This is because people have been probably looking for dance stuff online to maybe dance in their houses or whatever. And actually, this hasn't seen the same decline in interest. So I feel like it's something to bear in mind, some of the limitations with this data. And we have tried to do some manual checking. We have averaged over many terms to maybe reduce the impact of this kind of like ambiguous terms. But it's very much work in progress. How do we optimize like the way we extract the salient terms from the company descriptions and use that to Google search trends in a way that I guess helps us to address our research questions. And obviously in a way that's as automated as possible because we don't want to be checking everything. But just to see, in general, like you get like sensible things out of these salient terms. And actually, this is completely non-doctored. This is like a random bunch of like divisions that come out from just like from my script. And as you see, like the division that has to do with construction of buildings has lots of terms to do with houses. Waste collection, lots to do with recycling and waste. Publishing activities, news, games, Manufacture, actually, this one didn't work. And actually, you get very few terms. And I put it here just to illustrate that this is a work in progress in terms of like the results we get from Google search trends, and also to just to, I guess, flag up a caveat about working with complex pipelines and web data like what we're doing here. But the other ones you see, again, like security and investigation activities, it looks like the terms are relevant. Same thing for manufacture of fabricated metal products, except machinery and equipment. Lots of things to do with metals and stuff like that. And, interesting here is that this seems to be relevant for both sectors, which are like construction, services sectors, but also manufacturing. Seem to be picking up something about consumer interest about these sectors online. Okay, so then what we do, this simply is, again, like validation. What this is doing is looking at level of basically normalized interest on different terms by month. And basically the size of the circles is the volume of search. The color, which is not very informative here, alas, is the sixth section where the sector sits. And basically, if it's above 1, it means that there was more interest in this search term this year than in, this year's 2020 than in 2019. So everything's normalized. And I guess what's interesting, and actually, if we could click here and explore an interactive version of this chart, but I don't think I have time to do that. But the idea is that, for example, in March, we see lots of people searching for symptoms. I think it's this red one. In April, lots of people searching for deliveries. Alas, for Richie Sunak, in August, everyone looking for it, as in going out to eat, with the ill-fated government program to encourage people to go out to restaurants. And then more recently, everyone's looking for test. I think this suggests that our measures of search interest over time seem to be picking up intuitively, I guess, people's interest on different products and services, which might tell us something about sectoral exposure to COVID-19. Then what we do is basically, as I said, each of these things here is a SIG division, like a sector. I've just put the names, but each of these things corresponds to a sector. And basically, for each month, we basically rank them based on their level of exposure to COVID-19. In other words, those sectors that have the lowest level of search activity based on the keywords that we have identified belonging to a sector, and averaged over those and normalized by search in the previous year, we rank as the most highly exposed. And the sectors that are actually, in some cases, experiencing more search this year than similar month last year based on these keywords, we characterize them as less exposed. Again, we're quickly here to look at the interactive, but just to save time, the main point is that the sectors that appear as having high exposure are things like arts, museums, and libraries, travel agencies, as expected, perhaps. Low exposure, things like advertising, computer programming, waste removal. And actually, the nice thing about this is that we pick some of the changes of exposure over time monthly. So, for example, this sector here that is very exposed at the beginning of April and May, and then less exposed is construction. And this sector that appears generally quite exposed and the less exposed over the summer is accommodation. So we are picking up almost in a very timely way the way in different sectors have been exposed to COVID over time. Okay, and then we basically take all this information to geographical analysis. We can track exposure shares by local authority, district, and month. As I said, this is basically taking what is the share of employment in allocation based on business registered employment survey data in sectors that we have identified as highly exposed to COVID-19. And we can do this over months. And basically we can almost deep dive into the composition of local economies to understand the reason for their high or low exposure to COVID-19. And here I've simply almost created these charts, which basically tell us for each of the rankings of exposure to COVID-19, from lowest exposure to highest exposure, what is the share of employment in each of those sectors, in each of those categories, based on our method. And what this shows is that Richmondshire, that as you see here is really dark, as in very highly exposed to COVID-19 in April. The reason for this is that a lot of people working in real estate, a lot of people working in specialist construction, which is basically plumbers and things like this, accommodation. Whereas if you look at Cambridgeshire, like down here, actually it's relatively shielded because lots of people are working in things like research, education, programming, that at least in April were less impacted by the pandemic, at least in terms of based on our proxies. Yeah, so I mean, obviously later on I'm gonna look at the link between these variables and measures of outcomes in terms of claimant counts. But for now, just to say, with this kind of approach, we're able to generate quite nice indicators of exposure to COVID with, higher degree of granularity than what we were able to get from the official data, and also high level of timeliness in terms of being able to get them on a monthly basis. What this is not telling us really is the idea of diversification. So actually, look, here we are just looking at lots of, say, for example, 25% of the workforce in Richmondshire, around that, were working in sectors that were highly exposed to COVID-19. So the question is, which of those sectors could have diversified or would be able to diversify away from COVID-19 in ways that help this local economy be resilient? Basically, what we do here in order to look at this is the machine learning approach I mentioned before. So basically, the idea here is, again, to take these business descriptions and basically use them in a supervised machine learning model where we use the business descriptions to predict the sectors for a company. And I'm not going to get into the detail of the model that we trained. Again, there's detail about that in the annex, and we can discuss it later if you want. But basically, because the model is trained to predict whether a company belongs or not to each of the 6 divisions we are considering, we obtain a vector of probabilities for each of them. And basically, because we can then basically use this vector of probabilities to look, for example, at co-occurrences of sectors in the same company descriptions. And basically, we use these kinds of co-occurrence to build a network, which I guess you could call a sector space, building on the terminology developed by Cesar Hidalgo and Ricardo Hausmann, who did a similar thing in some ways, but for products instead of sectors. And this is what this thing looks like. And apologies for the quite messy and overlapping nodes kind of like chart. But basically, the idea here is the sector space. We have those companies, those sectors which are close to each other, are the ones that were more similar in their vocabulary. And our assumption here, and obviously it's a big assumption, is that if you are in a sector that's close to another sector, you might be able to move more easily into that than if you were further apart. In other words, if you are working in agriculture, it's going to be quite hard to move into advertising. If you're working into computer programming, it might be a bit easier to move into advertising. And what I've done in this network is simply color the nodes based on the level of exposure of different sectors to COVID in April. Again, we can build this kind of thing for every month. And what this shows is, for example, for example, here we have 90s creative arts very exposed to COVID. Maybe they could move into broadcasting, which is here. Land transport is here. 49, again, quite highly exposed, maybe could move into couriers. We have a severage here. Perhaps they could move into repair and installation of machinery. So it's giving us a sense of potential moves for companies in different sectors. And again, what we're going to do is take this kind of information, combine it with BRES, and use it to generate measures of the share of employment in different local authorities in sectors that are highly exposed to COVID but have low levels of have few diversification options. The way we measure this is by basically, for those sectors which are negatively exposed to COVID, we basically measure their mean distance in this sector space to all of the other shielded sectors. In other words, to other sectors which are not less exposed to COVID or not exposed to COVID. Basically, what this chart is doing is simply like each of the rows is one division, and basically it's telling us how many neighbors does a division have within the sector space, and what's the level of exposure of the neighbors. And then like this is the number of neighbors. So with this one is other administrative activities or something like that. It's such a vague sector that you could almost like move into any part of the network from there. But I guess what we see here is that sectors like accommodation, transports, and libraries, which are at the top, seem to have less neighbors, and actually the neighbors they have seem to also be quite exposed to COVID, consistent with the idea that it's going to be quite tough for these sectors to diversify away from the economic impacts of the pandemic. Whereas if you look at sectors down here, like actually this includes some knowledge-intensive sectors and retail activities, they have lots of different neighbors, and actually many of those neighbors are quite shielded from COVID, suggesting that they are going to have more diversification options. We can look at this stuff again, like from a geographical standpoint, and what this map is showing is simply for different local authorities, what is the share of employment in low diversification sectors. And we can see, for example, that for Stratford-on-Avon, which is like this really dark kind of like area here, the reason for this situation is that they have a lot of employment in divisions that are quite exposed to COVID and that have quite a hard time moving into other sectors which are exposed to COVID. Whereas if you look at, for example, at East Devon, the situation is different, and it's basically the size of the nodes is picking up the share of employment in these sectors. And you see Devon, loss of employment in sectors that are relatively shielded from COVID. And it's interesting, I mean, it's very hard to see in this network, but it will be interesting to see whether employment in industries which are exposed to COVID, is it actually industries where it's relatively easy to move into sectors which are less exposed to COVID. So, okay, moving into geographical patterns and relation with other variables, and I think I only have another couple of slides with findings, so I hopefully should be okay for time. We have considered the link between mean exposure share and low diversification share and NUTS1 category. And this is what is showing here. So what's for all of the local authorities in Scotland or Wales or until London, what are their shares of exposure and what are their shares of employment in sectors that have low levels of diversification. I think it's interesting that there's a mix of things in all of the NUTS1, but also interesting that, for example, London seems to be relatively high mean level of exposure to COVID-19, but they have the lowest lowest share of employment in sectors that have low diversification options, consistent with the idea that maybe London is exposed, but they seem to be in sectors that might be able to diversify away from exposure to COVID. And then what we do is we compare these variables with other measures about local economies from APS, the Annual Population Survey, Business Register Employment Survey, and annual surveys of hours of earnings. And what this is doing here is simply showing varied correlations between our variables that we have produced here and all this other secondary data. I think what's interesting is that this shows that places with more income, a level of education and economic complexity, I guess a proxy for the sophistication of the economy of one location, tend to be more exposed, as in strong correlation between those variables and the share of employment in highly exposed sectors. But actually, they tend to be more exposed, but they are less exposed in sectors that have low diversification options, consistent with the idea that these kinds of locations, which are more highly educated, wealthier, and more economically complex, seem to be exposed to COVID, but in sectors that might be able to diversify away from this COVID shock. And just to conclude, we have also compared basically analyzed the link between COVID-19, our measures of exposure to COVID and options to diversify away from COVID, and measures, I guess, of a proxy for the economic impact of COVID on a local economy, which is claimant counts. We know that this variable has some limitations. Actually, it shouldn't say TTWA here, it should say that. But we know that they have some limitations, but they seem to be a good proxy at this point for understanding how a local economy has been impacted by the pandemic. What this one is showing here is simply claimant count rates in local authorities in different NUTS regions, and actually this is normalized by the claimant counts for the previous year. So for every month, we look at claimant count rates, normalized by the same statistics in the same month last year. And what we see is almost for everywhere, actually, is this big jump in claimant counts from the moment the pandemic begins. So we think it's a reasonable proxy for looking at the economic impact of COVID, at least in the short term. Hopefully better data will become available over time. And just to conclude, because I am running out of time and this is very preliminary, we have modeled the link between basically claimant count proxies for the economic impact of COVID in a local authority and our measures of exposure and diversification to COVID. We do this within a panel setup where basically we have claimant data as the dependent variable, and we use either exposure or share of employment in sectors exposed to COVID, or share of employment in sectors with low levels of low options to diversify away from COVID. as the independent variables, including on the same period as the one where we are considering the claimant counts, as well as the average for all of the previous periods. We add controls and fixed effects for local authorities. And we consider as the dependent variables both the claimant count rate without normalizing and the claimant count rate normalized using months from before the pandemic. And I guess in general, what we find is a strong link between our measures of exposure and basically the claimant count outcomes, in the sense that places that are more exposed to COVID, according to our measures, especially in previous months, tend to have higher levels of claimant counts, and especially we see this when we consider the normalized measure of claimant counts, which is a better, I believe, a better impact, or a better measure of the impact of COVID-19 on the local economy. And obviously, this is just the beginning of the modeling, and much more work is needed to explore the spatial effects and robustness. This is actually work that we have been doing in the last couple of days, so we really need to go to town in terms of this analysis. But I think at this point, the sort of initial patterns that are coming from the analysis look promising in terms of, I guess, the extent to which our indicators that we have created here seem to tell us something about the exposure of local economies to COVID, and what this means in terms of economic impacts that they might suffer from the pandemic. Just to conclude, I guess our analysis has highlighted the potential of these data sources. We note that all of the novel data is a complement to the official data. Our findings suggest that local economies that are able to diversify away from COVID-19 are likely to fare better, and it looks like more complex and knowledge-intensive economies seem to be in a better position to be able to do this. So again, there's a question about whether COVID-19 might increase regional inequalities in the UK. And high-resolution timely maps of activity, exposure, and capabilities will be required to inform policies in this area. And it will be interesting to think about how all of the information we have collected here, because we are throwing away so much information in this presentation, could be used to be presented and visualized in a way that helps policymakers make decisions, I guess, with more granular and timely information. I have lots of things around things that we could do going forward, and additions and expansions, and ways to address limitations, and maybe some of these will cover things that you are going to be flagging up. So actually, I suggest that instead of getting into this as well, I leave it here, and we move into the questions, because I think I might have overrun a bit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juan. That was a fantastic presentation. You managed to cover a vast amount of work in a short amount of time. So thank you for structuring it so cleanly as well. As you can imagine, we've got a bunch of questions already. So let me just try and kind of bundle them together. So Bin and Julia had questions about your sort of fuzzy matching and how well that performs. So you might want to talk about that now, or that might be something to sort of share it through slides, particularly the kind of back end of the slides. Dom had a question about whether you would be able to or want to kind of create your own sector or kind of industry categories rather than using SICs, given that you have text information. And Adam had a question about how much diversification by firms might we expect to happen? So what's our prior on that? So do you want to take those three to start, and then there's a stack more behind that?
Great. So on the fuzzy matching, actually, it's a shame that Alex Bishop, I don't think he's with us today, because he's my co-author, and he developed it's called the Jackhammer, the algorithm that we have used for the fuzzy matching. Basically, I'm not even going to get into the technical details. Basically, this is based on the idea of local sensitive hashing of names in our business descriptions and names on the company's house data. And then we basically validated this by looking, in some cases, the business descriptions contain the company's house numbers. So actually we were able to almost like use that as a label data set to validate the matching. And it wasn't so much to validate the performance of the matching, but to find the right thresholds, I guess, that generated, seem to be generating good results according to that label data set. So we managed, out of 1.8 million companies in the GLASS data, we fuzzy match 1 million, and we get a score for each of them. And obviously some of these matches are garbage because it's almost like there's not enough information in some company names to be able to do the match, but some other matches are high quality matches. And basically we said, I think like Alex recommended a matching score of 60 as one giving us a high quality threshold. And basically, I think this leaves us with 400,000 companies that we then use to extract the keywords and to train the machine learning model I referred to. And one thing to say is that actually we are releasing that fuzzy matching algorithm like as its own tool, because it's obviously a general purpose kind of open source tool that people can use to do many matching things beyond what we're doing here. So hopefully if people are interested in that, we can share with them the details when that's live, and I'm very happy to discuss with them how to use it. It's something that's very exciting. In terms of creating our own sectors, I mean, I actually have this here. That's a very salient kind of question, very much in our minds, because the question is, how do we, we have like some SIG codes which are frankly very uninformative. This is just making our jobs harder in terms of understanding exposure and also understanding diversification. Could we replace, complement them with something that's completely bottom up? I guess my concern when doing that would be then basically that makes us completely reliant on the GLASS data for understanding exposure to COVID in different places. And the problem with that is that we know that the GLASS data is going to be potentially geographically biased in a way that we know the official data isn't. And also the GLASS data isn't going to tell us anything about employment. The GLASS data, because company websites don't really say how many people work in the companies in general, then we wouldn't be able to say anything about employment. There would be no, I can think of like a kind of obvious way to go from the websites to employment, unless we use the SIG codes, but then obviously that comes with some baggage, as the colleague mentioned. Just to flag that actually we are currently starting working in a project with ESCO, which is going to be about start exploring how to develop that kind of like bottom-up industrial taxonomy, which is maybe less weathered to SIG codes, or is weathered to SIG codes in some other interesting way that maybe create less lock into what we know is in many ways an imperfect taxonomy. And again, very happy to discuss all of that and definitely watch this space, because we're going to be publishing some findings around that work, hopefully in the next couple of quarters. Diversification that we might expect. Actually, I don't have any. I guess that's probably going to depend on the type of company. Like, for example, if we look at this business description here, it's almost like this company is already diversified. It's already like doing lots of things that sit within different SIG codes. So actually, even if it had like a priority, like say in working with brands, which I guess would be advertising, actually, or say working with cultural institutions, which is something where I guess there's been maybe like a big shock in terms of COVID-19, then they can move into brands or maybe broadcasting events, obviously, potentially like a big market, a growing market for that when we can all get together in live events. So for some companies, I feel that it might be easier. For some other companies or some other sectors, it will be harder. And it's almost like it's quite hard to come with some sort of like general statement about what this looks like. I feel like at the same time, I think it's quite interesting to think about, what places have almost like capabilities that might support that diversification, like in terms of like maybe business support, digital capabilities, again, the kind of thing you might expect to see in the more complex local economies. And it's almost like, what can we actually, would there be a way to assess almost like the extent to which different locations can realize the opportunities to diversify? I think the only way to evaluate that kind of analysis would be next year actually look at changes in employment in different sectors in local economies and see whether this is consistent with the model we have here, and whether, say, there have been locations where the switches, like say changes between sectors, are in line with what we have expected if businesses were diversifying, versus say situations where the changes have been just loss of employment, which would be consistent with the idea of places having either low diversification options or high diversification options that were not explored. So yeah, I guess a very long-winded question, but which I guess raises like something that we're going to be obviously doing as soon as the best data becomes available, like which is to actually look at whether, you know, the change in the composition of local economies is in line with what we would have expected based on this model, and if not, we can think about what have been the blockers to diversification.
I mean, that your example sort of suggests another question, which is, I mean, do you have any way of getting at where the, you know, I guess economists would call it reallocation, right? Where the reallocation is going on. So if is a company like the one here, our kid brother, is it basically going to stop doing some things it already does and focus on other things it already does? Or so is the diversification going to be a kind of reallocation within the set of products and services it has, or is it going to start doing something completely new? Have you got any way of getting at what type of diversification is going to happen, like whether it's across or within?
Well, that's like a really tough question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm partly asking for this project that you know, me and Mirko and others are working on, where we're trying to answer these kind of questions.
Yeah, so I mean, one obvious answer, which actually is much tougher than one would expect, is to simply compare the evolution of business descriptions over time, you know, and see what's dropping out and what's coming up. I mean, you would imagine if basically, I mean, imagine hopefully not the case, but the scenario where like our cultural industries are completely obliterated by COVID-19, and basically cultural institutions, these guys stop talking about cultural institutions in their website because there's no market there. Then maybe that would be, we could almost like have that comparison of descriptions over time. I think like the difficulty with doing that, and we have tried to do it, is that the method that Glass uses to extract the business descriptions from the websites is obviously automated, and basically it's based on a model that I guess predicts what is the most likely description of what a business does. So actually over time you're going to get different descriptions. So the question is, can you, if you compare, say, description now with description in 6 months, are the differences explained by changes in what the business does, or by differences in the description we have picked up when they're doing the data collection and processing? And again, this really illustrates some of the challenges with the big data. I'd say actually, and maybe this is actually might be an interesting idea, maybe if you could almost like create some sort of vector representation of descriptions over time, do a bit of dimensionality reduction on the descriptions, then maybe you could compare them over time, and hopefully, you know, even though maybe the description for our kid brother here is not the same from not the same part of the website, and in 6 months, you know, you would hope that the vector representations, because they remove some of the noise, would be closer to each other. So actually looking at changes in those vector representations might tell us a bit about the things which are appearing and the things which are disappearing. But yeah, that sounds like a very blue skies kind of R&D project with the class data.
Yeah, that will definitely be at the frontier. So actually, I had a related question while there's a pause in the chat, which I hope will be a bit more straightforward. Which is that there seems to have been a big jump in company formation this year. In, you know, there was a piece in the FT about this. I think if you look at companies' house registrations have really jumped up. And I guess some of that is correlated with the changes in unemployment, which you showed us. But presumably that's something that you can pick up certainly on the company's house side of your pipeline, and maybe in Glass as well. Is that something that you thought about doing as an extension to this?
I haven't, but I'm really thankful for the suggestion, because again, you would expect, you know, I mean, if basically we started to see that all of these new registrations are in sectors that we're identifying as high exposure, then that would suggest that we have a bit of a problem. So it's like a really nice, like almost like a very kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of validation. And obviously we find them appearing in the sectors which are either connected to high exposure sectors or in low exposure sectors that would be in line with what we're expecting here. So thanks, Max. That's the reason why it's always great to have a chat with you.
No worries. I'll send you the article link if you can't find it. So Sophie has a question. Could you? I think this relates to our question of how diversification happens, so the kind of the mechanism. So she asked, could you follow companies with the same ID and see how they self-describe and how that changes over time as a way of sort of getting at adaptation at the text level?
Yeah. Yeah, something like that really links with the point I made before, which is we can, because each company in the class data has a unique identifier, which is its URL. But the problem is, as I said, the fact that the descriptions can evolve over time in a way that's not necessarily reflecting changes in what the company does, but changes in what the class algorithm is picking up from the website. So I feel like, I'm maybe exaggerating the challenges with this. I guess if you basically were regularly picking up the websites and you average them or concatenated them or whatever, then hopefully you would be getting a more robust view of their evolution along the lines of what Sophie is suggesting. So yeah, that's definitely one to look at going forward. It's feasible but not guaranteed to work.
Great. So this is a important nuts and bolts question from Ivan Schlosser. What is the temporal and spatial precision of your data? And I guess there's various parts of your stack, right? So I guess we concentrate on the firm level stuff. What's the kind of what's the frequency and spatial IDs you've got?
So at the spatial level, we have postcodes. Like we have their addresses. They are extracted from the websites as well. So in principle, we could go down to that resolution. Obviously, because we match the data with Companies House, we get all of the information you get from Companies House, which is again like address level. Obviously, we know that that's super dodgy because very often companies put their accountant or their lawyer or whatever rather than their actual address. Actually, it's quite interesting that perhaps the glass data, because it's picking up the addresses that businesses mention in their websites, might be more accurate or a better proxy for the location of their economic activity than what you get from the Companies House. So in principle, you could do a match, more high resolution spatial analysis here than what we're doing, what we have presented. My concern around that, the reason why we haven't gone on that route, it basically links to maybe the conversation we were having before around why are we using the SIG codes, which is representativity and coverage, and also ability to look at employment, as well as ability to look at number of establishments or number of businesses. So yeah, and obviously, Mats, you're aware of the work that the PEC guys have released, around creative micro clusters, where they actually have used this, the class data to look at the creative industries clusters in the UK at the company level. So they are able to use a clustering algorithm to identify, I don't know, in Brighton, they identify 20 clusters or something based on a more, density-based approach to identifying clusters. So there's definitely lots of options to do that kind of thing. It's just not what we have decided to do in this analysis, but maybe something for us to do as we go forward, especially with the firm level analysis that I mentioned. I alluded to as something we're working on as well, but I haven't presented here. In terms of the temporal resolution, that's a bit of a...
No, that's...
Sorry, go on. Yeah, I was going to say... Yeah, it was so my point was around the geographical, spatial resolution. In terms of the geographic, the temporal resolution, it's a bit of a mess, right? Because it's not like companies, on the 1st of January, they go and update their websites. It's they update their websites, whenever, probably some of them never update their websites. Some of them constantly update their websites. Some of them go bust and still have a website. Obviously, all of us, I don't know how many of us have gone to get very excited about websites talking about open data sets that haven't been updated since 2010 or something. So So I think there's like a big challenge around the temporal use of the business website data for a temporal analysis, especially if one's interested in short-term kind of almost like more timely data, almost like do regular updates to build some sort of longitudinal data set. I would say that the way we have tried to address this in this project, and obviously I'm talking about the project rather than the paper, because our policy stakeholders are obviously, they don't really care for a snapshot or a cross section. They want to look at how things are evolving, but are aware as we are of these limitations. Has been to either think of COVID notices as a more timely measure of the impact or response of the impact of COVID on businesses or the response to it, because they are more likely to be updating these notices because obviously they relate to almost like the day-to-day of their interaction with their customers. And the other thing that we have been exploring, which is a complete nightmare in terms of like even adding more branches to the very gnarly pipeline I showed you before, is actually extracting social media profiles from the company websites and then collecting data from those. The idea being that even if a business doesn't update its website every day, probably updates its social media presence like Twitter or whatever like more regularly, and for example communicates information that might be relevant for understanding how COVID is having an impact on it. Like one example is a business using Twitter to talk about how it's got a sale, basically all everything must go style sale going on, which might be telling us something about either this business going out of business, or maybe like getting rid of a stock because they are going to be restocking with something else. So yeah, the business website data, I would say, not great for longitudinal analysis, but we are exploring how to use complementary, use the business websites as the seed for a snowball to collect additional data that gives us that more timely picture of what's going on with these businesses.
Yeah, those are two very nice ideas, I think, for trying to get high frequency stuff. Just to loop back to your previous points about, figuring out where these companies really are. Julia points out in the chat that Fame has got trading address info for at least half of, I guess,
nice.
active UK companies. So, I mean, this also links to some work that I'm doing with Tassos Kitsos, who is or was in the seminar, where we're basically trying to figure out which of these addresses is the right one, or how do we bundle them into units. So it's, as you say, it's a kind of figuring out the spatial precision of this stuff is a kind of a big and ongoing issue.
Okay, so a couple of observations on that, because I mean I've thought about Fame, because obviously Fame, at least for the larger companies, would tell us something about employment as well, and some of the economic stats that you can get from the websites. Because we have already matched class to company's house, it would be trivial to go to Fame, right? You have the company's house number. Yeah. So I feel like the only problem we have on my side is that we haven't licensed Fame, so we don't have access to it. So maybe there's like an economically motivated collaboration around that, where we come with the data we have been working with and combine it with your Fame data if you have access to it to some of those interesting analyses.
You should absolutely talk to Julia about this, because I know she's doing a major piece of work on this at the moment.
Excellent. And what else was I going to say? And similar, like I think it would be really interesting to almost like validate, find some way of like triangulating addresses using the class data, the Fame data, and the company's house data. And obviously one could get like the IDBR data as well, like in some sort of like a non-disclosive way. That would be really nice.
Yeah, that's a major. That would be superb. In fact, I mean, I think there's a number of us both in this seminar and outside it working on the same issue. So we should try and figure out a way to do that. But yeah, kind of linking in the IDBR stuff would be the way to check it all off. But it's a major, as you know, a major piece of work in itself. All right. We're having a fun conversation about very geeky stuff, but we are at 6 o'clock now. So let's stop the formal seminar here. I'm gonna stop the recording in a second, but huge thanks again to Juan for coming along and talking us through all of this fantastic work. It's a big round of virtual applause from all of us. Let me stop the recording now.